this seems to me to be a classic move to flatter Trump, to draw him in the hope that tomorrow we'll see not quite a repeat, but a version of what we saw in the Oval Office before, of Trump ignoring the fact that the Russians are the aggressors in this and putting all the pressure on Zelensky to settle.
Right, let me bring you the latest then, after President Trump's phone call with Vladimir Putin concluded. And let's actually begin by letting you hear from Caroline Leavitt, who is President Trump's press secretary, who has just been speaking to journalists outside the White House.
It was a very good and productive call. It lasted more than 2 hours. There were various issues that were discussed. President Putin congratulated President Trump for solving the conflict in Israel and Gaza and bringing peace back to the Middle East. He also thanked the First Lady for her efforts to bring back children and save children in this brutal conflict. And the President feels like great progress was made on this call. They also agreed to have a high-level senior staff meeting convened as early as next week, which will then be followed by a meeting very likely between President Trump and President Putin as well. They talked about Budapest as being a location for that. So as you all know, President Zelensky is coming to the White House tomorrow, so these discussions will continue, and frankly, I think the President deserves great credit.
That's the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, who was at least in the same postcode as a microphone, I think. Let me just read out for you what President Trump has posted on Truth Social. It's quite a long post, but I think it's worth reading. He says, "I've just concluded my telephone conversation with President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and it was a very productive one. President Putin congratulated me and the United States on the great accomplishment of peace in the Middle East, something that he said has been dreamed of for centuries. I actually believe that the success in the Middle East will help in our negotiation in attaining an end to the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin thanked the First Lady Melania for her involvement with children. He was very appreciative and said that this will continue. We also spent a great deal of time talking about trade between Russia and the United States when the war with Ukraine is over. At the conclusion of the call, as you were just hearing, we agreed that there will be a meeting of our high-level advisors next week. The initial meetings will be led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio with various other people to be designated. A location is to be determined." President Trump a bit stronger on the following than you just heard. "President Putin and I will then meet in an agreed-upon location, Budapest, Hungary, to see if we can bring this inglorious war between Russia and Ukraine to an end. President Zelensky and I will be meeting tomorrow in the Oval Office, where we'll discuss my conversation with President Putin and much more. I believe great progress was made with today's telephone conversation." Anna, President Trump is talking up another meeting with Putin.
He is, and of course, after Alaska, I think it would be slightly bizarre to set great hopes on this. There's no particular reason in terms of the situation on the ground to think there's a big difference. Of course, what's clear from Donald Trump's position is he's been so buoyed by his experience with Gaza and his success there in terms of getting the ceasefire and the process of peace to start, that he now feels like maybe he's on a roll. So, that could be a positive thing. However, and he has been putting more pressure on Putin. However, I think anyone who has been following the Gaza situation closely might be pretty disheartened by this, because it confirms the fear that Donald Trump will shift his attention too quickly away from the Middle East, because what the process in Gaza needs now is for him to continue to keep an eye on it, to keep that pressure up and to play a role. So if he's suddenly then now shifting to something else, whether domestic or this or Ukraine, then that's not a particularly great thing for Gaza. The other thing I would just flag, though, in terms of that statement, I mean, how interesting to see Melania Trump name-checked and singled out in the conversation by Putin. It really plays into this completely different role she's playing in the second administration, much more political, much more hands-on, and she has been credited in shifting Trump's position on both Gaza and Ukraine.
And in the last week, 8 children were rejoined with their families, said Melania Trump in a statement that she gave. It is notable that, isn't it, Adam, her involvement in all of this, and what it kind of points to by way of a potential for a tone shift and a change of approach from President Trump as he gets ready to meet Zelensky tomorrow.
Well, I read into this that Putin is very worried. that Zelensky was going to the White House tomorrow, that there's a lot of talk that the Americans were going to agree to supply long-range Tomahawk missiles. It's quite clear that the war is a stalemate, and it's also clear that the Russians are taking more casualties than the Ukrainians, and this seems to me to be a classic move to flatter Trump, to draw him in the hope that tomorrow we'll see not quite a repeat, but a version of what we saw in the Oval Office before, of Trump ignoring the fact that the Russians are the aggressors in this and putting all the pressure on Zelensky to settle. Zelensky has played Trump quite well, but again, I think the fact that there was the reference to the children and all that, you could say the Russians have got a cheek when they've taken tens of thousands of children from Ukraine, but that was something which Melania raised, and I think she's probably a Russian speaker, isn't she? From
good question. I'm not sure.
From her growing up in Slovenia, and. So basically it seems to me that Trump, having said several times recently that he's fed up with Putin, that Putin is not delivering, and apparently making a friendly gesture towards Zelensky, that this is a move to stymie that and complicate that.
One of our guests earlier, Anna, it was George Beebe from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and also former director of the CIA's Russia analysis. And he actually said, in anticipation of this readout of this call and in anticipation of the meeting with President Zelensky tomorrow, that one thing Trump is going to have to consider here is closing the door to the coalition of the willing in order to make progress with Putin, i.e. to take off the table this idea of some sort of European peacekeeping force, and actually to nudge in the direction of a UN-led peacekeeping force which would be more palatable to Russia. And I was just quite struck by his analysis that the coalition of the willing's involvement could be a real stumbling block that may need to be moved out of the way over the coming days.
Well, that's curious, but I'm not sure how realistic it is considering Donald Trump's position on the UN. That would be quite an about turn for him to suddenly say that the UN would have an active role, because he has been nothing but damning about the UN and its effectiveness. And also, how much appetite is there really in the UN to play such an active role? One of the problems is the UN has been so timid in recent years, and it has been years, even before the Ukraine war started, that it's quite hard to imagine. The coalition of the willing has managed to mobilise well and effectively, and continues to do so, and has played a big role in keeping Trump interested as well. So, it's interesting analysis certainly, but I sort of it would be quite an about turn from Trump. It would also
contradict Trump's whole approach to Europe and NATO, because he's been increasingly saying Europeans have got to take the burden, they've got to organise themselves, they've got to defend themselves. America's not doing that. Now, if you suddenly start getting the United Nations involved, then that is globalising it, and it's putting to a certain extent the weight back on Trump. There was also talk, wasn't there, of the UN possibly being involved in an interim force in Gaza, and that is certainly not something that Trump has rushed to grasp.
Yeah. On Ukraine, Adam, just to return to how we started our conversation with your thought of the day, Ukraine is somewhere that there is foreign policy consensus across party.
And it's an area where Britain has been commended, and Britain has had a voice, partly because of that cross-party position. The clear decision of Labour to support the Conservatives when they're in power and to continue their policies. So that is sort of proving my argument.
And that was one of the moments when Keir Starmer, while leader of the opposition, actually looked the most serious, the most like a leader in waiting, when he praised the government and made that point of, we stand with you and we are not going to criticise you on this when Russia invaded. So it is interesting to move from that to the more squabbling of this over China.
Yeah, indeed. Dan gets in touch saying, wouldn't it be interesting if the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize were to be awarded to Melania Trump? Which is an interesting thought.